Some people say that the Pharaoh of the Exodus drowned in the Red Sea, but what does the Holy Bible say? And what does the Holy Bible not say? Whenever we discuss this topic, we should carefully examine Psalm 136:15. First of all, be cognizant that Psalm 136:15 does not explicitly say that the Pharaoh died. In this video, I will be examining Psalm 136:15 in Young's literal translation. Psalm 136:15 in Young's literal translation reveals that the Lord God shook out the Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's army. Exodus 14:27 in Young's literal translation says, quote, Jehovah shaketh off the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. In Psalm 136:15 in Young's literal translation, the English words shook out were translated from the Hebrew word naer. And in Exodus 14:27 in Young's literal translation, the English words shaketh off were translated from the Hebrew word naer. Although the Hebrew word naer can reference scenarios in which fatalities have occurred, the Hebrew word naer does not always reference fatalities. Samson used the word naer in Judges 16:20 when he said, quote, shake myself, unquote. However, Samson did not kill himself in Judges 16:20. He died later. In Judges 16:20, naer did not reference a fatality. In Nehemiah 5:13, the Hebrew word naer appears 3 times, but it does not reference fatalities. All words and all Bible verses should be understood in context. Now, remember Exodus 14:27 in Young's literal translation, quote, Jehovah shaketh off the Egyptians in the midst of the sea, unquote. In Exodus 14:27 in Young's literal translation, the English words shaketh off, which were translated from naer, do effectively allude to a scenario in which many Egyptians so happened to have died in the Red Sea. However, Exodus 14:27 does not explicitly say that the Pharaoh died. Now, going back to Psalm 136:15, Psalm 136:15 in Young's literal translation says that God, quote, shook out Pharaoh and his force in the sea, unquote. Of course, many fatalities did occur when the Egyptians were shook off. The pursuing Egyptians were cut off by seawater, and many Egyptians drowned. However, the Pharaoh may have been shook off in a non-fatal context. The Pharaoh quit pursuing the Israelites when he got shook off. If some bank robbers rob a bank and then flee in a getaway car, hopefully police officers arrive in time to start pursuing that getaway car. The getaway car goes fast and takes several turns, and unfortunately the bank robbers might shake off the pursuing police cars. If so, the police officers will get shook off, but that does not mean that any police officers died when they got shook off. The Pharaoh and his entire army were shook off, but that does not mean that they all died. Psalm 136:15 does say, in the sea. If somebody simply points out the fact that the word in Psalm 136:15 means that the Pharaoh was shook off in the Red Sea, then carefully consider the following Red Sea scenarios. Suppose that when the Pharaoh's army started filing into the miraculous seabed pathway, the Pharaoh was rather nervous and suspicious about that strange new pathway that had incredibly opened up across the Red Sea. Suppose that Pharaoh, who greatly valued his own precious life, stayed in the rear with the gear. Suppose that his army gradually filed into the seabed pathway for about 20 minutes or more, and then it was Pharaoh's turn to enter the seabed pathway. Suppose that the Pharaoh actually did enter the seabed pathway. Now, think about it. If you stand on the shore of a sea, then you actually step into the sea and take several steps away from the shore, then you might be in water that is merely up to your ankles. And then you take several more steps, and then the water level is halfway up to your knees, and then you continue walking further into the sea, and then the water level is up to your knees, and you walk further, and then the water level is over your knees. You get the idea. The further that you walk into the sea, the deeper the water level becomes. Based upon Psalm 136:15, it is evident that the Pharaoh did travel into the seabed pathway, but how far did the Pharaoh travel into the seabed pathway? Suppose that he advanced 10 meters into the seabed pathway. Of course, at that point, the Pharaoh would have not yet been wet simply because he was on the dry seabed pathway. But simply be cognizant that initially a water wall was to his right and a water wall was to his left. Read Exodus 14:22 to see a reference to that miraculous phenomenon. Now, we should ask the following question. If the Pharaoh traveled 10 meters into the seabed pathway, how high were the two water walls at that specific location? 10 meters into the seabed pathway. Suppose that each water wall was merely knee deep or 18 inches high at that specific location in the midst of the sea on the seabed pathway. If the water walls collapsed when the Pharaoh was at that location in the midst of two short, shallow water walls, then when the water walls collapsed, the Pharaoh merely got wet up to his knees, for instance. If he was walking, any people riding on chariots in the midst of 18-inch high water walls may have merely felt water splash onto their feet and ankles when the waters rushed towards their chariots. They would not have drowned in the Red Sea. Nevertheless, any people who were in the midst of mere 18-inch high water walls, when the water walls collapsed, got shook off in the Red Sea. In a non-fatal context, they would have stopped following the Israelites. Any such people got shook off, but did not die. Pharaoh may have been such a person. At this point, we should briefly discuss a certain technicality. Did the Pharaoh walk into the seabed pathway, or did the Pharaoh ride on a chariot into the seabed pathway? One of the points here is that if the Pharaoh was in the midst of mere 18-inch high water walls when the two water walls collapsed, then he would have initially got somewhat less wet if he was up on a chariot than he would have if he was walking down on the seabed pathway. That having been said, when I mention Pharaoh traveling into the seabed pathway, that phraseology can reference Pharaoh having walked, and that phraseology can reference Pharaoh having rode on a chariot. Of course, Pharaoh could have traveled 30 meters into the seabed pathway, and the water walls on either side could have been, for instance, 2 meters high at that distance from the western shore of the Red Sea. And suppose that the water walls collapsed when the Pharaoh was at that specific location. In that scenario, in 2 meter deep water, the Pharaoh would have got wet and he would have swam back and then waded back towards the western shore of the Red Sea, if at all possible. It is important to be cognizant that there is a scenario in which the Pharaoh got soaked with water but did not get completely covered by very tall, collapsing water walls. If the Pharaoh had 2 meter high water walls on either side when those water walls collapsed, then he would have quickly been slammed from both sides after the waters rushed towards him, and his hair would have got splashed, especially if he was walking rather than riding on a chariot. However, in that scenario, the Pharaoh never got completely covered by water. All of that having been said, we do not even know if the Pharaoh had 2 meter high water walls on either side when the water walls collapsed. Suppose that the Pharaoh had 1 meter high water walls on either side when the water walls collapsed. In that scenario, if he was not on a chariot, then he would have got significantly soaked from both sides after the waters rushed towards him. However, he would not have actually been required to swim back to the western shore of the Red Sea if the water level was merely 1 meter deep. He could have simply turned around and waded back to the western shore of the Red Sea. He would have initially been in waist-deep water, 1 meter deep water, but of course, as he got closer and closer to the western shore of the Red Sea, the water level would have gradually become more and more shallow, and his hair was not soaking wet. He never got completely covered by water in that scenario. Now, think about this. Suppose that you were an Egyptian soldier who had marched or rode on a chariot 500 meters into the seabed pathway. The tops of the water walls on either side would have been way over your head. And when they collapsed, you would not have been swimming home, would you? It would have been fatal. Any soldier who marched that far into the seabed pathway definitely would have drowned when the water walls collapsed. All such soldiers were shook off in the Red Sea in a fatal context. Those Egyptians stopped pursuing the Israelites because those Egyptians drowned. Exodus 15:19 references the Pharaoh's horses and chariots and soldiers having traveled into the seabed pathway, and Exodus 15:19 references the water walls having collapsed onto the Egyptian army. However, Exodus 15:19 does not explicitly reference the Pharaoh having got completely covered by water, nor does Exodus 15:19 explicitly say that literally all of the Pharaoh's army got completely covered by water. Nehemiah 9:11 does not explicitly say that the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, nor does Nehemiah 9:11 indicate that the entire Egyptian army drowned in the Red Sea. We should also carefully examine Psalm 106, verse 11. First of all, be cognizant that Psalm 106:11 does not explicitly say that the Pharaoh died. Psalm 106, verse 11, and the waters covered their enemies, there was not one of them left. Psalm 106:11 does not explicitly reference verbatim all of the Israelites' enemies. Furthermore, even if the Hebrew word kol, Strong's 3605, did appear in Psalm 106:11 and was translated into the English word all, then we nevertheless would still not necessarily know whether or not the Hebrew word kol was being used in a universal context in terms of the entire Egyptian army. For all we know, Psalm 106:11 actually indicates that drownings occurred exclusively in the instances in which Egyptians got completely covered by water. Those Egyptians did not remain, were not left, in the context of surviving. Genesis 7:19 reveals that the flood waters covered all mountain peaks. The English word covered in Genesis 7:19 and the English word covered in Psalm 106:11 were both translated from the Hebrew word kasa, Strong's 3680. If the Pharaoh's entire body was not covered by water, then the Pharaoh was not covered. And remember that Psalm 106:11 does not explicitly say that the Pharaoh died. Psalm 106:11 does not even explicitly reference the Pharaoh. And always remember this. If somebody tries to convince you that the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, then remember that there is not a single verse in the entire Bible that explicitly says that the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea. Suppose that 99% of the Pharaoh's army got completely covered by water, and suppose that not even one of those soldiers was left after they got covered by water, after the water walls collapsed on them. That might be what happened to 99% of Pharaoh's army, and the words in Psalm 106:11 can reference such a scenario, a non-universal scenario in relation to the entire Egyptian army. And always remember this, Psalm 106:11 does not say there was not one enemy left. Psalm 106 verse 11, King James Version, says there was not one of them left. Who was them? Does the word them refer exclusively to the enemies who got completely covered by water? Read Psalm 106:11. And the waters covered their enemies. There was not one of them left. Always remember that Psalm 106:11 does not explicitly say verbatim, not even one of their enemies was left. For all we know, the word them in Psalm 106:11 actually refers exclusively to the Egyptian soldiers who got completely covered by water. If the Pharaoh and every single one of his soldiers got completely covered by water, then it would be appropriate for Psalm 106:11 to say, the waters covered all of their enemies. However, the word all does not appear in Psalm 106:11, nor does the word Pharaoh. After considering every word in Psalm 106:11, it is clear that we cannot soundly claim that Psalm 106:11 categorically proves that the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea. Psalm 106:11 does not even explicitly reference the Pharaoh. If the Pharaoh was in mere knee-deep water when the water walls collapsed, then the Pharaoh did not get covered by water, compared to covered mountain peaks in Genesis 7:19. If it was a given that the Pharaoh was in mere knee-deep water, not covered by water, then it would not surprise anybody if the Pharaoh did not drown in the Red Sea. After considering everything that has been discussed so far, think about this. After the water walls collapsed onto the Egyptians, not one Egyptian remained on the trail of the Israelites. All Egyptians, including the Pharaoh, had been shook off in the Red Sea. Psalm 106:11 and Psalm 136:15 are true and correct, and neither of those Bible verses indicates that the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea. If Exodus 14:23 actually references literally all of the Pharaoh's army and the Pharaoh going into the seabed pathway, then be cognizant that some chariots advanced further into the seabed pathway than others did. If Pharaoh was in the rear with the gear, then his chariot may have had, for instance, 1 meter high water walls on either side when the water walls collapsed. But of course, the chariots in the front would have had significantly higher water walls on either side when the water walls collapsed. If Exodus 14:23 explicitly declared that the Pharaoh and the chariots that were at the very rear advanced so far into the seabed pathway that the water walls on either side were very tall, then we would have a Bible-based foundation on which we could claim that the Pharaoh and all of his chariots got completely covered by water when the water walls collapsed. If it was a given that Exodus 14:26 actually references waters having completely covered the Egyptians, then we would need to remember the facts that Exodus 14:26 does not explicitly reference the Pharaoh, nor does Exodus 14:26 explicitly reference all of the Egyptians. After having carefully examined the Holy Bible, we can see that the Holy Bible does not say that the Pharaoh of the Exodus drowned in the Red Sea. But why does this matter? What am I really getting at here? Here it is. Thutmose III was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. The Exodus occurred in approximately 1446 BC, but Thutmose III did not die until approximately 1425 BC, approximately 20 years after the Exodus. And of course, when we realize that the Exodus occurred in approximately 1446 BC, we can understand that any claim that the Holy Bible says that the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea in 1446 BC will be used to make the Holy Bible look like a fraud. Critics of the Holy Bible say the Bible claims that Thutmose III drowned in the Red Sea in 1446 BC, but Thutmose III did not die until 21 years after 1446 BC. Therefore, the Bible must be a fraud. In reality, the Holy Bible is the Word of the living God. Jesus Christ is the Messiah of Isaiah 9:6 and the only begotten Son of the living God.